The US ambassador to the UN said that her country would not pull its troops out of Syria until its goals were accomplished after the US, UK and France launched airstrikes in Syria in response to alleged chemical attacks. What will this mean for the ongoing conflict in the country? Video clips about the suspected chemical attack at Douma aroused suspicion when sources showed the white helmets filming in a studio are scenes being staged to create a particular narrative. The UN has been unable to stop escalation in Syria and has rejected Russia's proposal to condemn aggression by the US and its allies. Is there anything the UN can do to have an effect in Syria? The UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has said the Cold War is back with a vengeance. He also warned about the dangers of escalation over Syria. Is a new Cold War really coming, and how would it differ from the previous one?
The conflict in Syria is into its 7th year, and it doesn't seem close to its end, as the US led a new round of airstrikes 2 days ago, claiming that the Syrian government used chemical weapons in Douma. Aside from the brutality of the conflict, there is another hotly contested battleground, the media war for Syria. Major Western countries, through their powerful media engines, accused Damascus of using chemical weapons on civilians, even while lacking hard evidence. This creates a dangerous realm where deadly force can be justified through conjecture and false morality, and echoes of the search for yellowcake and WMDs in Iraq. Surprisingly, the White Helmets, a foreign-founded NGO, has been strongly accused as being a disinformation unit and propaganda that is influencing this ongoing war. To discuss these issues and media hegemony in the Syrian war, I'm joined in the Beijing studio by Mr. Hua Liming, former Chinese ambassador to Iran, Professor James Ray from California State University in Sacramento, and Mr. Atul Anija, an associate editor of The Hindu, an Indian newspaper. We shall also speak via satellite to a political analyst from Sputnik International News Agency, Dmitry Babich. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Ray. Welcome to Dialogue, gentlemen. There is a popular joke that went viral on the internet. When President Putin was asked why he attacked Syria, he said President Assad possessed chemical weapons, or WMD. But then Mr. Putin asked him, why didn't you attack the DPRK? He said, well, he does have a WMD. What do you make of the joke?
Thank you for having me again within 3 days. Really, it's a bitter joke. And it tells us the military attacks by the United States, UK and France has nothing to do with chemical weapons. It's nothing but an excuse to attack Syrian government. It has some reasons, because chemical weapon is a topic that can make their justification for this military attack. Otherwise, they won't have any reasons to have this military attack. This is my take.
And your position, Atul?
Yeah, I think that the attacks come when you don't have WMDs. The reasons, the examples of that are not too far back. When Saddam Hussein did not have any weapons of mass destruction, that's when the attack took place. Gaddafi surrendered all his nukes around 2007. And after that was done, and he was feted in various Western capitals, but then he was taken out. And so I think the same example holds conjecturally for Syria as well. They don't have it, and that's why you attack. But if you do have it, like North Korea does, then it's a different story.
In this context, James, are you therefore optimistic about any denuclearization in the Korean Peninsula?
Well, I am optimistic about denuclearization in the Korean Peninsula because of the recent efforts to begin a dialogue process. I think we're in a better position than we were 6 months ago in the DPRK. Unfortunately, the Syrian conflict is heading for 1 decade, and that doesn't look like it's going to be easily resolved. There's been no attempt to start negotiations, so we're in this chaotic zone.
This time the Russian military said that they have clear evidence that the so-called chemical attack in Douma was again staged by the White Helmets. Now, do you agree that there is a propaganda war?
Personally, I would quite agree with the Russians' takes, because until now we don't have any hard evidence of the chemical weapons, whether the chemical weapons was used. Personally, I have some suspect of chemical weapons, whether it was used, if it is used, by whom it was used. I don't see any reasons for the Syrian government any need to use chemical weapons in Syria battle war, because the Syrian government is winning the war. The chemical weapons is always used when one of the parties are losing the battleground. But now the things are the same thing. It gives me when we review the military attack by the United States, of course it didn't happen, but in 2013 the same excuse was used, that the chemical weapons was used by the Syrian government, and the Obama administration was almost to start a military attack against the Syrian government. Of course, later it didn't happen, but the same thing happened, repeated again in Syria. So that's why I said it's nothing but an excuse to launch a military attack against Syrian government.
There's nothing wrong to execute the sense of justice, be you a journalist or a civil servant or engineer, whatever. However, in the vocabulary of the media, it seems that whenever you put chemical weapons together with women and children, you always come up with a phrase like indiscriminate use, to kill. Now, what do you make of the sensational nature of the media this time around? And this quickly reminds us of what happened a few years ago when a 7-year-old boy was washed ashore to the beach of Turkey, and that immediately caused a tsunami reactions from the European governments. Prime Minister Angela Merkel decided to accept up to 1 million refugees because of the sensational arousal by the media about the tragedy of families, those who were left homeless by the civil strife in Syria in particular.
This is not the first time that this tool has been used. The combination of media and psychological warfare with a supposedly sometimes a fake humanitarian crisis. This has been a standard practice. I can recall from my coverage of 2009 in Iran elections, the woman was shot, all the cameras were focused over there, and it was assumed that the regime had done it, and that started a propaganda war against Iran. Now that incident is 2009, and then fast forward to what happened here, supposedly happened in East Ghouta. Now, all of us saw the video. If you have a chlorine attack, the first symptom which you show is blisters, you burn. You see none of that's happening. You see the medics not wearing any protective gear when you should be when there is a chemical attack. So there are various loopholes in this very story. Third, your focus is not on the people who would be streaming into the hospital at this time, which would be indiscriminate, but the camera is selectively focusing on emotive images of children in deep suffering. So to me, there is a strong reason to suspect A, whether this happened at all, just staged, as you mentioned in your original remarks, and if it did, then it is not consistent with what would happen if a chlorine chemical weapon attacks take place. The third point is, therefore, this needs to be investigated in much more detail than what has been done till now.
It is difficult to tell whether this is a fact, fiction, or fallacy. Now, James, do you represent the American media in voicing the sense of justice, preemptive strikes, whatever, President Assad is a bad guy, he got to be taken out? What do you think of the air campaign?
Well, I would voice the consistency of the U.S. foreign policy has been to not intervene into Syria, and has propelled the collapse of more friendly regimes in places like Egypt, but a country that's hostile in Bashar al-Assad's regime. The U.S. and President Obama was committed to no boots on the ground and not removing him. President Trump also is very reluctant to get involved, has committed to the U.S. to withdraw, and I think only responded because of the suspicion that this is likely to has been a chemical attack, and doesn't seem to have any further plan to use military strikes.
Well, it's said to be the one-time airstrike, but who will be the most apparent winner in this use of chemical weapons against the innocent, given the sectarian violence in the Middle East? Who is likely to be the winner? I mean, since you have expressed your strong doubts about whether A, this has happened, B, who has launched the chemical weapon attacks. Now, who are the real perpetrators? I mean, without hard evidence, we cannot give our hunch. But who, in theory, should be the winner and the beneficiary of the chemical attacks?
I think the real winner will be the Syrian oppositions who are fighting against the Syrian government.
But who are those opposition groups?
And those are backing Syrian oppositions from outside. I don't know which country was doing that. Anytime when United States announced that the United States to soften their position in Syria, or they are going to leave Syria, a chemical weapon issue happened. This, I think, very benefited by the Syrian government, that they can keep Americans in the Syria, to lead to not let the Americans leave Syrian government. So I think the oppositions and their backers outside of Syria are the real winners.
Do you agree, too, that this is an ongoing proxy war? Do you agree that this is a matter of sectarian violence between Sunnis and Shiites in the Middle East?
I think it's conflating the civil war and the larger geopolitics of the region. Now, to your question, who would benefit of a chemical attack? I would assume that if a chemical attack has taken place, it should, as it has happened earlier, lead to regime change, that is, removal of Assad. Now, if Assad is removed, we are conjecturing now, then there are clear beneficiaries. One is his implacable enemy, which is Israel, on one end, and on the other end is Saudi Arabia, which wins because of its sectarian element comes in over here, between the deep animosity between Saudi Arabia and Iran, because Iran gets hit if Assad goes. So I think these two in the region would be clear-cut winners if the chemical weapon attack were to lead to regime change in Syria. I think in the long run, other countries have to be wary if this happens, but that's going too far. It should come further down to Russia and China. But let's not go to that. In the region, I can say these are the two.
And James, what's your take about the beneficiaries and the winners?
I think there's no clear winner. I think ISIS has largely collapsed, and I think the Saudis are then vulnerable to losing their role in Syria. But if the U.S. is not going to have a consistent intervention policy, this kind of one-year strike a year ago, a couple strikes here, and then moving on in case there's another chemical attack, leaves Assad and I think Russia and Iran confident that the U.S. is not going to be fully invested, and so why not move forward? And again, 2013 attack, Syria was in a weaker position, and that was opposition forces were much closer to Damascus. Now Syria is in a position of strength, so of course it doesn't seem to make sense, but it could also be the final blow. But of course it could, we don't have the evidence yet, or even from 2013 we don't have the evidence of who is responsible. There's incentive for the opposition to gain American intervention, and may have hoped this would lead to it. It'd also be logical for the Assad government to use this as a weapon as well.
And I was a little bit surprised that President Putin has kept it pretty quiet, despite the strong noise and protests that Moscow released ahead of the missile strikes. Now, do you think Russians are clearly aware of its own weaknesses? It simply doesn't have the strength to combat or push back the collective airstrikes by the three countries, the United States, Britain, and France. Or should one of the missiles attack the Russian air base or military base in Syria, this polar bear will definitely respond very angrily.
I think this military attack has been a very well coordinated war.
Carefully designed
Carefully
to bypass
designed.
the sensitive targets of Russians.
Was informed before by the United States, UK, and France. So, and the military attacks by the three parties has been very cautiously and very carefully chose to avoiding the Russian bases, even the Iranians. So only the Syrian military targets, and even civilians were not killed. So I think this has been a very good coordinated military attack between the United States and Russians. So that's why President Putin has been very cautious in his statement against this military attack.
Are you a fan, James, about the theory that the hotline must have been established between the two militaries, Russia and the United States, before the airstrikes were launched?
Well, I would think so, but I think President Trump is certainly very reluctant to in any way offend Russia and Putin, but some of the Trump team, I think, sees the need for the U.S. to demonstrate its credibility. I think President Trump, because he was so critical of President Obama's red line on the 2013 attack, feels a personal responsibility to back up his words, but in a very limited way, and certainly nothing that would harm Russia's interests and lead them to escalate.
The first missile strikes that were ordered by President Trump occurred during the summit meeting between President Xi Jinping and your president in Mar-a-Lago, Florida. This is the second, I'm afraid, of its kind. So what do you think of the presidency of Donald Trump? Now, Comey, former director of FBI, said in his book and in his testimony that President Trump is not fit morally for the post of a presidency. Do you think he's trying to break away from domestic scandals such as Stormy Daniels, Russian contacts, his lawyer who was arrested on charges of bribing, the superstar of the porn industry? So what do you think of domestic politics and their influence on the ongoing airstrikes in Syria?
I think Washington is collapsing. I think we're on our third national security advisor in a little over a year. The presence of John Bolton is a very challenging sign for what a U.S. responses will be in the Middle East. Facing the Stormy Daniels case, the Russia investigation, his lawyer, all these things I think are so much pressure that I'm not sure how long the presidency will survive with Donald Trump in power. Having said that, I don't think the strike in Syria was a response to wag the dog and turn attention away. I think it's his sincere commitment to back up, even if chemical weapons are not much different than conventional weapons. I think that's sort of his enforcement of a red line that, much like the Iran deal that he's been so critical of with President Obama.
Thank you so much. Let me cross over to Mr. Dmitry Babich, a Russian guest speaker who's standing by in Moscow on satellite. Hello. It seems President Trump is fighting...
Yes, nice to hear from you.
Yes, it seems President Trump is fighting a war on three fronts. A, trade war with China. B, media war. And C, I'm afraid, is the current missile strikes against the Damascus regime. What do you think of the aim that he wants to achieve?
Well, I think President Trump is very unpredictable and inconsequential in his actions, but he doesn't decide too much in the United States. In fact, we have seen it during his more than a year of presidency that actually the United States is not run by an elected leader. As soon as Mr. Trump got elected, he was kind of limited in his decisions, not by democratic institutions, but basically by the globalist ideology which the former President Obama represented and which continued reigning in the United States despite its obvious defeat during the elections. For Russia, Russia was not happy about Trump's victory. It was happy about Hillary Clinton's defeat, which I think is natural because Hillary Clinton compared Russia to the Third Reich, made many other very bad insults, so there was no reason why Russians should love her. But basically, President Trump is now following the same policy, and I think until he is following it, especially on the international arena, the establishment in Washington won't insist on removing him. So he is safe, I think, on the domestic front. I think Stormy Daniels will be taken out of her sheath and used again only if Mr. Trump starts misbehaving against this globalist ideology. As for his trade war with China, I think he will lose because you can't be a hostage to globalist ideology on one side and defending American pragmatic interests in a trade war with China on the other side. As for his strategy in Syria, I just don't see a strategy. Okay, there was this missile strike, very risky, very dangerous. The Russian anti-aircraft defense could react, and then the war, the world would be at the brink of a war. He did it. He risked a lot. But okay, he bombed these few objects in Syria. What is the next step?
Dimitri,
the United States does not have a replacement.
It seems that President Trump has nothing to lose, but everything to gain. If you look at the current missile strikes, is the air raid a show of sympathy for the British ally of the United States after the alleged use of military nerve gas to kill the double agent? Do you think by attacking President Assad, Mr. Donald Trump wants to show solidarity with the European allies to divert attention from domestic woes?
Well, the problem is that the Skripal case in the UK is collapsing. I mean, the UK immediately after the poisoning accused Russia of doing it without presenting any evidence. The UK Prime Minister used some very dramatic expressions like a chemical attack against the UK by the Russian Federation, which was simply irresponsible. Is Mr. Trump showing solidarity with her? Maybe solidarity in unprofessionalism. Before the attack, President Trump called the Syrian President Assad an animal. This is not diplomacy. See, this is simply not professional. And this is why these people, Theresa May and Donald Trump, are dangerous as national leaders. They're behaving unpredictably and unprofessionally. But the problem is that neither the UK nor the United States, not even France, they have no strategy for Syria. They made this very dangerous missile strike, but they have no replacement for President Assad. There is no viable political force that would rebuild Syria.
It seems, excuse me, Dimitri, we have to come back to the Beijing studio discussion here about the role of the United Nations. Sure. Ambassador Hua, Atu and James, it seems once again the UN Security Council has been bypassed by not only the United States but allies of Europe. Without having the unanimous UN security resolution, they just went ahead with the airstrikes. Therefore, the spokesperson of the Chinese Foreign Ministry, Madame Hua Chunying, said this is a violation of the UN Charter, which prohibits any use of coercion to stop a violation of whatever international law. So you need to have a political solution. But then the Americans and Europeans would complain, hey, the UN resolution wouldn't have any teeth. So what do you think of the dilemma?
You see, United Nations was not built for a global government. Actually, neither Security Council nor the General Assembly has the authority to rule the sovereign states in the world. Only they can pass some resolutions. Even the resolutions could be vetoed by 5 permanent members. So I don't think the United Nations could do anything to prevent any kind of war, as we have seen in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in all other places. So we cannot expect the United Nations to do so, because the United Nations doesn't have the authority to do that.
Do you think what's going on in the UN Security Council is actually haunting specter of the Cold War, since China has more than before used many vetoes? to show our solidarity with the Russians on the issue of chemical weapons in Syria in particular. And Mr. Li Baodong, our former ambassador to the United Nations, was criticized by Susan Rice, the former ambassador of the United States to the United Nations. She was so angry with the Chinese, but China said, look, what happened in 2011 was the violation by NATO of UN Resolution 1973, which prohibited any military intervention to oust Gaddafi. But it happened. He was killed. So the Russians and Chinese decided to draw a red line for Europeans and Americans. But this time around, the red line was bypassed by Europeans and Americans. So what do you think of the role of the UN Security Council? Is that just what happened during the Cold War? It's just talking shop for a place for vetoes and anti-vetoes.
But it does reflect, Ray, about what you mentioned about the beginning of a new Cold War. And you can trace it really to the point 2011, the killing of Gaddafi. Because that's where you see this division coming very deeply reflected in the Security Council, where the Russians and the Chinese are together. And so the cleavages start being visible from that point of time, because to my mind, that was a recognition that what happened to Gaddafi, or what happened a little before that to people like Saddam and Arafat, was not a case of anything else but regime change. And for both Russia and China, Syria would become the first defense line, because if Assad gets toppled geographically, then Iran gets exposed. And if the Iranian defense line goes, then you come to Eurasia, which is the core interest of both Russia and China. So therefore, this had to be stopped. But I do think that the beginning of the Cold War can be traced to 2011, amplified by the recent State of the Union address by Trump and the defense report which came out, which has identified both China and Russia as possible adversary. So I think you are right when you say that this is the beginning of the Cold War, and the United Nations is becoming a reflection of that, and therefore no consensus.
Well, what makes me a little more optimistic is that the 5 permanent members have agreed on sanctions toward the DPRK, on sanctions toward Iran in terms of the development of nuclear weapons. And in this case, the Middle East, there are diverging interests, and so we see rivalry. And I agree that if the UN Security Council does not authorize the use of force in a country like Syria, it's an illegal act. But I do think there are moments, such as in Yugoslavia, when intervention may be necessary to stop catastrophic human rights abuses, even if one permanent member is objecting.
Very quickly, I give the floor to Mr. Dmitry Babich for his analysis on the immediate prospect of having a new Cold War. What would be the worst-case scenario if a new Cold War were to happen between and among the permanent members of the UN Security Council?
Well, I think this is not a new Cold War. This is much worse, because during the Cold War, at least in the beginning of it, the Soviet Union and its allies considered themselves revolutionary states, progressive states that need to change the world. Now, and they were in the minority. Russia and China were in the minority in the 50s, in the 60s, during the real Cold War. Unfortunately now, it's the majority. It's the United States and the European Union who want to change regimes in other countries. They are the revolutionaries now. And that makes the situation a lot more dangerous.
Excuse me, you only have 30 seconds, so before we wrap up the discussion, it's time. Yes, go ahead. Only 30 minutes.
I will be very
30 seconds, I'm sorry.
Yes. Yes, so it's a lot worse now than the old Cold War, and unfortunately Europe now is even worse than the United States in terms of aggression. You mentioned Yugoslavia. The reason why Europe and the United States went there was because they expected to find hundreds of thousands of killed Kosovo Albanians there. They didn't find them. It was a lie. So it was the first Western aggression.
Thank you so much.
On a lie.
Thank you so much, Dmitry. Thank you so much. Well, obviously, Mr. Kim Jong-un would not give up the nuclear weapons, given what's going on in Syria. But we're going to continue our discussion next time. Until then, goodbye.